You're sitting outside. Maybe it's your back porch. Maybe it's the edge of a field. Maybe it's a wildlife rehabilitation center where you volunteer on weekends. And then something happens that stops you completely. A wild animal, a deer, a fox, a bird, a cat that has never let you within 10 feet of it, walks toward you. Slowly, deliberately. And it puts its baby down in front of you, or presses it into your hands, or simply stands there holding it up toward you in a way that is unmistakably intentional. And then it looks at you. Not away, not at the ground, at you. The story most people tell about that moment is a beautiful one. The animal trusts you. It loves you. It recognizes something in you that it doesn't see in other humans, a gentleness, a connection, a bond that transcends the usual distance between species. You've been chosen. You've been seen. That story is not entirely wrong, but it leaves out the part that's actually interesting, because what's happening in that moment isn't quite what the story suggests. The animal isn't performing an act of love, the way a human would perform one. It isn't feeling what you'd feel if you handed a newborn to someone you cherished. It's running a program, a very old program, refined across millions of years of evolution, for solving one of the hardest problems any parent faces in the wild, keeping something small and helpless alive in a world full of things that want to kill it. And that program, the one that tells a wild animal to walk up to a specific individual and place its most vulnerable offspring in that individual's care, is one of the most sophisticated social assessment algorithms in the natural world. The question isn't why animals trust us. It's what trust actually means when it comes from an animal, what process produces it, and why more and more wild animals seem to be pointing it toward humans, specifically at a time when the landscapes they evolved in are rapidly disappearing. The heartwarming video of the deer and the baby is real. The emotion you feel watching it is real. But the explanation is stranger, older, and considerably more complicated than the caption usually admits. Let's start with what we think we know about why animals do this. The popular explanation runs roughly like this. The animal has been around this particular human long enough to form a bond. It associates that human with safety, with food, with calm, and when the most important moment of its life arrives, the arrival of offspring, it naturally brings that new life to the individual it trusts most. Just like a human might call their closest friend the moment a baby is born. That explanation feels right, because it maps onto something we understand deeply. Human trust is earned through time, through consistency, through repeated positive experience. We project that same logic onto the animal. And the projection is emotionally satisfying because the behavior does look, from the outside, almost exactly like what a trusting human would do. The problem is that it attributes the mechanism to the feeling, rather than to the thing that produces the feeling. What ethologists, scientists, who study animal behavior in natural settings have documented over decades of research is that the behavior of introducing offspring to specific individuals is not primarily about affection. It's about a much older and more specific calculation. Identifying which individuals in a social environment are likely to contribute positively to offspring survival, and actively recruiting those individuals into the work of keeping the offspring alive. This behavior has a name in behavioral ecology. It's sometimes called alloparental solicitation, the active seeking of care from individuals other than the biological parent. And it shows up across species so diverse, in contexts so unconnected, that it clearly predates anything as recent as the human-animal bond as we usually think about it. It predates domestication. It predates the cognitive complexity we associate with the animals most famous for displaying it. The assessment that underlies this behavior is not, at its core, emotional. It is evaluative. The animal is asking, in the only language available to it, behavior, proximity, repetition, observation, a very specific question. Is this individual safe, stable, and likely to help? When the answer is yes, the offspring gets presented. When the answer is no or unknown, it doesn't. What looks like love from the outside is, at its computational root, a survival calculation. That doesn't make it less remarkable. In some ways, it makes it considerably more remarkable, because it means the animal isn't just feeling something vaguely positive about you. It has been running a continuous, ongoing assessment of your behavior, your consistency, your responses to stress, and your track record as a presence in its environment. And it has concluded, based on that assessment, that you are a resource worth incorporating into the project of keeping its offspring alive. That is not a small thing to have earned. It's just not quite the thing the caption on the video says you've earned. Here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because the behavior shows up in places it has absolutely no business showing up. Start with octopuses. In 2023, researchers and experienced recreational divers began documenting something unexpected at a dive site off the coast of Jakarta, Indonesia. Octopuses that had regular contact with the same divers over extended periods were observed doing something that looked, from the outside, remarkably like gift-giving, bringing shells, debris, and other objects and presenting them to specific divers rather than others. One account described an octopus returning repeatedly to the same diver over multiple visits, each time bringing something new to the surface of its den. Octopuses are solitary animals. They have no social structure in the conventional sense. They don't form groups, they don't cooperate in raising offspring, and they have a lifespan short enough that most never meet their own young. They are about as far from a social mammal as a vertebrate-brained creature can get. And yet something in the octopus's assessment of consistent, non-threatening human presence produced a behavior that looks functionally similar to what a highly social mammal does when it decides a particular individual is worth incorporating into its circle. This matters because it suggests the underlying evaluation mechanism, the process of identifying stable, benign presences and orienting toward them, is far more ancient and far more broadly distributed across the animal kingdom than the heartwarming mammal videos would suggest. It isn't a product of the social complexity of wolves or elephants or dolphins. It appears to be something much more basic, something that runs in animals with radically different nervous systems under the right conditions. Now move to the elephants. Joyce Poole is one of the world's foremost elephant researchers, having spent decades studying wild elephant behavior in Kenya and other parts of Africa. She has documented multiple cases of wild elephant mothers deliberately introducing their newborn calves to specific human researchers, approaching them directly, positioning the calf between themselves and the human, and waiting in a way that is unmistakably presentational rather than merely incidental. Elephants are extraordinarily social animals, with demonstrated capacity for long-term individual recognition, grief, and what researchers carefully describe as empathy-adjacent behavior. Their social networks are dense, multi-generational, and critically important to offspring survival. Calves in elephant society are raised not just by their mothers, but by aunts, grandmothers, and other females in the herd. The behavior of presenting offspring to trusted individuals is deeply embedded in elephant social structure. What Poole's observations suggest is that certain human researchers, through years of consistent, non-threatening presence, have been incorporated into something that functions like the edge of an elephant's social network. Not as elephants, not as herd members, but as known quantities, assessed and categorized as safe and stable by an animal whose survival literally depends on making those assessments accurately. The elephant isn't confused about what a human is. It knows perfectly well that you're not an elephant. The categorization isn't about species, it's about behavioral profile. Then there's the otter case, documented by wildlife rehabilitators across multiple facilities in the United States and the UK. River otter mothers who had been rehabilitated and released animals that had significant human contact during their recovery have in documented cases returned to the release site or approached known rehabilitators with pups, placing them briefly in human hands before retrieving them. Not abandoning them, not surrendering them, presenting them briefly and then taking them back. This behavior is particularly striking because river otters are not domesticated animals, and their time in rehabilitation is relatively brief compared to the length of a relationship that would normally produce this kind of trust. And the behavior serves no obvious practical function. The human can't nurse the pup, can't follow the otter back to its den, can't contribute anything immediately useful to the pup's survival. What it does, functionally, is something more abstract. It extends the assessment. The otter is checking whether its evaluation of this human still holds, whether the individual who was safe and consistent during rehabilitation remains safe and consistent in a new context. It's a test as much as a presentation. The offspring is the instrument of the test. Across these three cases, the octopus, the elephant, the otter, the behavior looks different on the surface. The species are wildly different. The contexts are wildly different. The cognitive machinery underlying the behavior is almost certainly wildly different. But the functional logic is the same. Identify a stable, non-threatening presence. Assess its consistency over time. When offspring are at their most vulnerable, incorporate that presence into the protective network around them. That pattern is old. much older than dogs, much older than domestication, much older than anything we usually think of when we think about the human-animal relationship. The scientific framework that makes sense of all of this comes from an unlikely place: the study of how humans raise children. Cooperative breeding theory, the idea that offspring survival in some species depends on care distributed across multiple adults rather than concentrated in a single parent, was developed primarily to explain human reproduction. Why do humans have such helpless babies? Why do human children require years of intensive care that no single parent can realistically provide alone? The answer is that humans evolved to share the load. Grandmothers, aunts, siblings, unrelated group members, the entire social architecture of a hunter-gatherer band was organized, at a deep biological level, around the collective project of keeping children alive. What researchers have increasingly found is that cooperative breeding is not uniquely human. It appears across a wide range of species: meerkats, wolves, some birds, elephants, certain primates, and wherever it appears, it produces the same associated behaviors. Animals in cooperative breeding systems develop sophisticated capacities for individual recognition, for tracking the behavioral history of specific individuals, and for soliciting care from those individuals at key moments in the reproductive cycle. The presentation of offspring to trusted individuals is one of those solicitation behaviors. It is the animal's way of activating a known member of its cooperative network at the moment when that network is most needed. What makes the human cases interesting is that the human was never supposed to be part of that network. Humans are not meerkats. We are not wolves. We were not, for most of the animal's evolutionary history, the kind of stable, non-threatening social presence that cooperative breeding systems evolved to incorporate. And yet the algorithm doesn't know that. The algorithm doesn't check species. It checks behavioral profile. It asks, has this individual been consistently present? Has this individual been non-threatening? Has this individual responded appropriately to signals of distress or vulnerability? If the answers are yes, the individual gets incorporated into the network, regardless of what it looks like or what species it belongs to. The neurochemical mechanism underlying this process is oxytocin, sometimes called the bonding hormone, though that description is too simple. Oxytocin regulates trust, social recognition, and approach behavior across mammals. It is released during positive social interactions, during nursing, during physical contact between individuals who have established a positive relationship. Critically, oxytocin release and the trust behaviors it drives are not species-specific in the way most people assume. Studies have shown that positive interactions between dogs and their human owners produce oxytocin spikes in both the dog and the human, the same hormonal response that occurs between human mothers and infants, occurring across a species boundary. The animal's brain is not producing a new, special response to the human. It is producing its normal social bonding response, the one that evolved for conspecifics, for members of its own species, because the human has satisfied enough of the behavioral criteria that the system treats the human as functionally equivalent to a trusted group member. There is also a relevant body of research on alloparental care provided to offspring by individuals other than the biological parents. In species that practice alloparental care regularly, the capacity to solicit that care from known individuals is well documented and appears to involve active assessment rather than passive acceptance. A female elephant doesn't just let any adult female in the herd near her newborn. She selects. She observes. She makes judgments about who is safe and who is not, based on accumulated behavioral history. When that same selectivity gets applied to a human researcher who has spent years in consistent, non-threatening proximity to a wild elephant population, the researcher is being processed by the same assessment system that the elephant uses to evaluate potential alloparents within its own species. The fact that the researcher is human is, from the perspective of that system, a secondary detail. The behavioral profile is what matters. This is what the heartwarming videos are actually showing you. Not a cross-species romance. Not an animal that has transcended its nature to love something it shouldn't. An ancient social algorithm, running on ancient neurochemistry, doing exactly what it evolved to do, and doing it on a human, because a human happened to satisfy the inputs. Here's the part of this story that almost never gets told. The behavior we're describing wild animals incorporating specific trusted humans into their protective networks around offspring is not new. It is not a product of conservation centers. wildlife rehabilitation programs, or the particular kind of human-animal proximity that modern life creates. It is almost certainly very old. Old enough that it was a regular feature of the world our ancestors lived in, rather than the exceptional viral moment it feels like today. Hunter-gatherer bands did not live in a landscape emptied of wildlife. They lived inside it. The same forests, the same river corridors, the same seasonal territories, year after year, generation after generation. The animals in those landscapes were not strangers. They were neighbors. Specific individuals that specific humans saw regularly, whose behavioral patterns they knew, whose movements they tracked, whose offspring they watched grow up. From the animal side of that relationship, the calculation looks exactly like the one we've been describing. Here is a large, potentially dangerous creature that has been consistently present in this territory for years. It has not attacked. It has not destroyed a den. When it encounters my offspring, it does not threaten them. Over time, if that pattern holds long enough, the animal's social assessment system does what it evolved to do. It begins to incorporate the human into the behavioral landscape it navigates, assigning them a profile, tracking their consistency, and eventually, in some cases, recruiting them into the protective network around vulnerable young. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that this dynamic was real and regular in ancestral human environments. The earliest confirmed dog domestication events, dating to at least 15,000 years ago and possibly much earlier, appear to have begun exactly this way. Not with humans capturing wolf pups and breeding them into compliance, but with wolves self-selecting toward human camps because human camps were reliable sources of food scraps and predictable, non-lethal social environments. But wolves were not the only animals making that calculation. Burial sites from Mesolithic and Neolithic Europe and the Near East have produced remarkable findings: human graves containing the remains of foxes, deer, wild boar, and various birds, arranged in ways that suggest deliberate, careful placement rather than coincidental proximity. At the site of Ain Malaha, in what is now Israel, dated to roughly 12,000 years ago, a human skeleton was found buried with its hand resting on a puppy. The positioning was intentional. The relationship it memorialized was specific. What we don't know is how many of those relationships involved wild animals approaching human settlements with their young, presenting their offspring to specific individuals the way the deer and the otter and the elephant do today. But the behavioral infrastructure for it was clearly present on both sides. It wasn't miraculous then, it was ordinary. It was part of the texture of a world in which humans and wild animals shared the same landscapes at close quarters for thousands of years at a time, and in which the boundary between human social networks and animal social networks was considerably more permeable than anything we experience today. The miracle isn't that it happens. The miracle is how rare it has become. Here's what the heartwarming video doesn't show you. The landscape behind the deer. The silence where there used to be other deer. The absence of the social network that animal would have recruited from, if that network still existed. Because here's the thing about the ancient algorithm we've been describing: it didn't evolve to recruit humans. It evolved to recruit conspecifics, members of the animal's own species, other deer, other otters, other elephants. The system was built for a world in which those individuals were available, in which the landscape was full of potential alloparents who shared the animal's evolutionary history. That world is gone for a lot of species. Not everywhere and not completely, but substantially, measurably, increasingly gone. Since 1970, monitored wildlife populations globally have declined by an average of 69%, according to the World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet report. That is not 69% of species lost. That is 69% of individuals, the actual animals, that would have constituted the social networks, the alloparental support systems, the cooperative breeding structures that species like deer and otters and elephants evolved to rely on. When the algorithm runs in that landscape, when the animal looks around for stable, consistent, non-threatening individuals to incorporate into its protective network, the humans are often the only candidates available. Wildlife rehabilitators who work with injured and orphaned animals know this dynamic intimately, and many describe it with a mixture of tenderness and discomfort. The animals in their care do, genuinely, form attachments. The oxytocin system runs. The assessment algorithm runs. The humans pass the test because they are consistent and safe and present. And when the animal produces offspring, the rehabilitator is who it turns to, not because the rehabilitator is the ideal candidate for the role, but because the rehabilitator is there. One wildlife rehabilitator in Oregon, speaking about a river otter she had raised from a pup and released, described what happened when the otter returned with her own young. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever experienced, she said. And then, after a pause, she added something that didn't make it into the caption on the video that went viral. She said she kept thinking about where the otter's mother had gone, and the mother before that, the chain of conspecific knowledge, the accumulated behavioral wisdom that should have passed from otter mother about which parts of the river were safe, which threats to avoid, how to read the landscape, had been broken somewhere. And the gap had been filled, imperfectly, by a human with a rehabilitation permit and a lot of frozen fish. This is not an argument against wildlife rehabilitation. It is one of the most valuable things humans do in a world that we have substantially damaged. But it is worth being honest about what the viral video represents. Not just the beautiful part. Also the part underneath it. The question of what happened to everyone else it might have chosen instead. So go back to that moment. You're sitting outside. The wild animal walks toward you, deliberate and slow, and places its baby in front of you, or presses it into your hands, or simply holds it up in your direction and waits. It looks at you. You know now what that moment actually is. Not a miracle, exactly, though it feels like one. An ancient algorithm, running its assessment, concluding that you are stable enough, consistent enough, safe enough to be incorporated into the network that keeps this small, helpless thing alive. The same algorithm that ran between deer and deer, between otter and otter, between elephant and elephant, for millions of years before a single human was part of the calculation. You passed a test you didn't know you were taking. That is real. The oxytocin is real. The assessment is real. The trust is real. None of what we've covered diminishes the moment. If anything, it makes it larger. Because what the animal is doing is not projecting human emotions onto a different kind of relationship. It is doing something far older, and in some ways far more rigorous than what a human does when they decide to trust someone. It has watched you. It has measured you. It has run every behavioral data point it has about you through a system refined across geological time, and the output of that system is this one. This is the one I bring my young to. But the question worth sitting with is this. Is it bringing its young to you because you earned it? Or because you are what's left? Both things can be true simultaneously. Both things often are. The animal's trust in you is genuine and meaningful and the product of real evaluation. And the world that should have provided it with 100 other candidates for that trust has been substantially, measurably reduced. Often by us. The animal doesn't know that. The algorithm doesn't factor it in. The assessment runs on available inputs, and you were available, and you were consistent, and you were safe. That's enough for the algorithm. That's always been enough for the algorithm. Whether it's enough for us is a different question entirely. The next time you see that video, the deer, the otter, the elephant, the bird, and you feel what you feel watching it, which is real and worth feeling, remember that you're seeing two things at once. You're seeing an ancient system work exactly as it was designed to work, across a species boundary it was never designed to cross, producing something that looks almost unbearably like love. And you're seeing a world in which that system increasingly has nowhere else to go. Both things deserve your attention. The animal chose you. The question is what we're going to do about the world that left it with so few other choices.